and the Stonehenge should not exist. It defies the technology, logic, and social limits of its time. Remembers, yet it stands silent evidence that ancient humans understood something modern civilization may have forgotten. Remembers, before there were kings, before empires, before writing, before history had a voice. Remembers, there was a place where human beings attempted something that should not have been possible. Remembers, a place where people without metal, without wheels, without mathematics as we know it, tried to bend time, death, and the sky into stone. They did not leave behind an explanation. They did not leave a name. They left a question. Stonehenge. Remembers, even today, standing alone on the open chalk plain of southern England, it does not feel like a ruin. It feels like an interruption. Remembers, as if the land itself was forced to pause around it. Remembers, as if something vast once passed through this place and never fully left. For more than 400-500 years, Stonehenge has watched humanity change silently. Remembers, entire civilizations rose, flourished, and collapsed while these stones remained. And the most unsettling truth is this. Remembers, the people who built Stonehenge may have understood something about reality that we still struggle to grasp. Welcome to Empire's Historical. Stonehenge does not begin with stones. Remembers, it begins with the land. Remembers, long before the first human ever walked across the Salisbury Plain, this region was forming beneath a warm, shallow sea during the Cretaceous period, nearly 100 million years ago. Over countless generations of microscopic marine organisms living and dying, thick layers of chalk accumulated on the seabed. Remembers, when the sea eventually withdrew, it left behind a vast white foundation, porous, stable, and unlike almost any other soil in Britain. Remembers, this chalk would shape everything. Unlike heavy clay soils that trap water and shift under pressure, chalk drains easily while remaining structurally firm. As rainwater disappears into it, feeding underground aquifers that surface as springs and rivers. The River Avon, flowing just 2 miles from Stonehenge, exists because of this geology. Reliable water, open grassland, and solid ground. This was not just a landscape. It was an invitation. Remembers, and humans answered it earlier than we once believed. It's around 8000 BC as the last age loosened its grip on northern Europe. The small groups of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers moved into this landscape. Remembers, they did not come to build monuments, as they came to survive. They followed migrating animals, harvested seasonal plants. Remembers, and learned every contour of the land with an intimacy modern people rarely experience. At a site known as Blickmed, just a short distance from Stonehenge, remembers, archaeologists discovered evidence of continuous human activity spanning more than 3,000 years. This was not a temporary stop. Remembers, it was a long-term relationship between people and place. As these early inhabitants lived lightly. Remembers, their shelters were made of wood, hide, and bone materials that left almost no trace behind. Remembers, but their impact was not invisible. They understood fire. Remembers, they used it deliberately, burning patches of vegetation to create grazing areas that attracted animals. This was not random destruction. Remembers, it was environmental management. Remembers, for the first time, humans were not just living in the landscape. They were shaping it. As their tools reveal a similar sophistication. Remembers, flint nodules embedded in the chalk were transformed into blades sharper than steel scalpels. Microliths, small, precisely shaped stone tools, became arrowheads, knives, and hunting implements. Remembers, these people were not primitive. Remembers, they were specialists, adapting perfectly to the open downland environment. But they did not build monuments. So that came later. Remember, around 4000 BC, something changed that would alter human history forever, as people stopped moving. Remembers, the transition from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle to farming did not happen overnight. It unfolded slowly across centuries. But its consequences were irreversible. Domesticated cattle, sheep, and pigs appeared on the Salisbury Plain. Wheat and barley took root in the chalk soil. But for the first time, people produced more food than they needed to survive. Remembers, and surplus changes everything. Farming demanded permanence. Fields had to be protected. Animals had to be managed. Storage became essential. Remembers, Neolithic houses began to appear, large rectangular structures built with timber frames and walls of woven branches sealed with clay. These were not shelters. They were statements of intent. People were staying. With surplus food came specialization. Not everyone needed to farm. Some became potters. Others became flint craftsmen, but some organized labor. Some led ritual. Remembers, and when societies develop hierarchy, they begin to think differently about time, ancestry, and memory. Remembers, this is when the Salisbury Plain transformed into something unprecedented. Remembers, across the landscape, massive earthworks began to appear. Long barrows, elongated burial mounds rose along ridgelines, housing the remains of generations. Remembers, causewayed enclosures formed circular gathering places where communities came together for feasting, trade, and ceremony. Then came the Cursors monuments. Remembers, the greater Cursors, built around 3500 BC, stretches nearly 2 miles across the plain. Remembers, parallel banks and ditches define a corridor 100 meters wide, cut with astonishing precision across even terrain. Remembers, thousands of tons of chalk were moved using antler picks and bone tools. This was not practical construction. It was symbolic. No one lived in the Cursors. Remembers no crops were grown there. It was built for meaning. Remembers the alignment of these monuments with the horizon, with solar and lunar events, reveals a worldview obsessed with cycles, life and death, seasons and renewal, the visible and the unseen. Remembers the Salisbury Plain was becoming a sacred landscape layered with intention. By 3000 BC, this region had one of the densest concentrations of ritual monuments in all of prehistoric Europe. Remembers people traveled here. They gathered here. As they buried their dead here. Remembers, and then in the midst of this already sacred terrain, something unprecedented was conceived. Stonehenge. The first Stonehenge was not a stone circle. It was an idea. A perfect circle carved into the earth. A boundary between worlds. Remembers, a place where the living could stand inside time itself. Remembers, when the builders dug the ditch and raised the bank, they aligned its entrance with the rising sun on the longest day of the year. This was not coincidence. It was precision. It was cosmology expressed in architecture. Remembers, inside the circle, 56 pits now known as the Aubrey holes were placed with mathematical regularity. Remember, some would later cremated human remains, making Stonehenge one of the earliest known cremation cemeteries in Britain. Others likely held wooden posts, forming temporary timber circles that came and went with ritual cycles. Remembers, this was not a monument meant to be finished. It was meant to be used. For centuries people returned. They buried their dead. They feasted. Remembers, they watched the sun rise and set along predetermined lines. They rebuilt, rearranged, adapted. Stonehenge was alive. Remembers, and then something even more astonishing happened. Remembers, the builders decided that earth and wood were no longer enough. They would bring stone. Not just any stone. Stone from far away. Stone that carried memory. Remembers, stone that carried meaning. Remembers, but before we follow them into that impossible journey, pause for a moment. Remembers, because everything that came later, the bluestones, the sarsens, the trilithons towering against the sky, rests on this foundation. A landscape chosen with care. A society transformed by surplus. A belief that the universe could be ordered, measured, and honored through human effort. Stonehenge was not built by accident. Remember, it was built by intention. For an intention is the most dangerous force humans possess. Remembers, if you're enjoying this deep exploration into humanity's forgotten past, subscribe to the channel and support Empire's Historical. Remember, your support helps us continue creating long-form, research-driven documentaries that go beyond surface-level history and into the ideas that shaped civilizations. Remembers, before we continue, here's a question for you. Remembers, do you believe Stonehenge was primarily built as a place to honor the dead, or as a tool to understand the sky? A sacred space for ancestors and burial rituals. Remembers, be an astronomical instrument designed to track time and seasons. Comment or be below. Remembers, your answer might reveal more about how you see the past and yourself than you realize. If Stonehenge began as an idea rooted in earth and sky, remembers, then what followed was the moment that idea demanded commitment not just of belief but of bodies, labor, and time. Remembers, because to turn a sacred landscape into a permanent ceremonial center, belief alone was no longer enough. It required organization. It required sacrifice. Remembers, and it required a society willing to act together at a scale never attempted before. Remembers, what emerged on the Salisbury Plain after 3000 BC was not merely a monument in progress. Remembers, but a social experiment, one that tested how far cooperation, ritual obligation, and shared meaning could stretch human limits. Remembers, the people who returned to this place generation after generation were no longer simple farming communities bound only by kinship and land. Remembers, they were participants in something larger. Was a regional system of movement, exchange, and ceremony that extended far beyond the horizon. Remembers, by the late Neolithic period, Stonehenge had already become a destination. Remembers, archaeological evidence shows that people were traveling significant distances to reach the site. Remembers, pottery styles, flint sources, and burial remains indicate visitors arriving from different parts of Britain, and even from across the Channel. This was not casual travel. Remembers, journeys took days, sometimes weeks, across difficult terrain. Remembers, people came because Stonehenge had meaning that could not be replicated elsewhere. But meaning alone does not move hundreds of people at once. Remembers, something more structured was taking shape beneath the ritual surface. Remembers, to understand this transformation, we must look not at the stones but at the spaces around them. Remembers, less than 2 miles from Stonehenge lies Durrington Walls, the largest henge monument in Britain. Its scale dwarfs Stonehenge. Massive earthworks enclose an area large enough to hold entire communities. Remembers, excavations here have revealed the remains of large timber circles, domestic structures, and most strikingly evidence of enormous feasting events. Remembers, thousands upon thousands of animal bones litter the site, particularly cattle and pigs. Remembers, many of these animals were slaughtered at specific times of year, suggesting seasonal gatherings on an unprecedented scale. Isotope analysis shows that livestock were brought from across Britain, as meaning communities contributed resources far beyond their local needs. Durrington Walls was not a place of burial. It was a place of the living. Remembers here people drank, negotiated alliances, arranged marriages, exchanged goods, and reaffirmed social bonds. Remembers the presence of houses suggests temporary but repeated occupation, a settlement that came alive during ritual seasons and then faded again. This was the other half of Stonehenge. Remembers while Stonehenge itself appears increasingly associated with death, ancestry, and cosmic order, Durrington walls embodied life, renewal, and social cohesion. Remembers together they formed a ceremonial system linked by movement, ritual, and belief. Remembers the connection between these two places was not symbolic alone, it was physical. Remembers a formal avenue connected Stonehenge to the River Avon, and similar routes linked Durrington walls to the same waterway. The river was not simply a source of water. Remember, it was a boundary, a passage between states of being. Remembers movement along the river mirrored transitions between life and death, the mundane and the sacred. Remembers participants may have travelled by water from Durrington walls to Stonehenge, shifting roles along the journey from celebrants to mourners. Remembers from the living to those honouring the dead. Remembers this spatial choreography reveals something profound. Remember, Stonehenge was not built by isolated geniuses or centralized rulers. Remembers it was constructed by networks of communities who shared obligations, rituals, and calendars. Remembers leadership existed, but it was embedded in tradition rather than imposed by force. Remembers this kind of cooperation required more than authority. It required belief. Remembers, and belief alone still does not explain what happened next. Remembers because sometime around 2600 BC, the builders of Stonehenge made a decision that defies practical logic even today. They would bring stone from Wales, not from nearby outcrops. Remembers not from the Marlborough Downs where suitable sandstone lay waiting. They chose stone from the Preseli Hills of southwestern Wales over 150 miles away. Each stone weighed between 2 and 4 tons. This was not convenience. This was intent. Remembers geological analysis has confirmed that the blue stones at Stonehenge come from multiple quarry sites in the Preseli region. These stones were not random. Remembers they included spotted dolerite, rhyolite, and volcanic ash materials with distinct visual and tactile properties. The choice of Preseli stone mattered. For over 1,000 years before Stonehenge, remembers the Preseli Hills had been a source of stone axes distributed across Britain and continental Europe. These axes were not merely tools. Remember symbols of prestige, authority, and connection to powerful landscapes. As Preseli was already sacred. Remembers by extracting stone from this ancestral terrain and transporting it to Salisbury Plain, the builders were not moving raw material. They were relocating meaning. The quarrying process itself reveals extraordinary planning and technical knowledge. At sites such as Craig Rosewiffelin and Carn Goedoc, remembers archaeologists have uncovered evidence of controlled stone extraction dating to around 3000 BC. Remembers fires were built against rock faces, then rapidly cooled with water to fracture the stone. Wooden wedges were driven into natural cracks to split monoliths free. Remembers charcoal layers from these quarry sites indicate that stones were extracted centuries before they arrived at Stonehenge. Remembers this suggests that some blue stones may have first been used in local Welsh monuments before being dismantled and transported east. But if so, the stones carried not only geological identity but ritual history. Remembers the transportation itself was a feat bordering on the impossible. The most widely accepted theory proposes a combination of land and water routes. Remember, stones were dragged from the Preseli quarries to the coast, loaded onto rafts, and transported along the Welsh coastline. Remembers, from there, they likely travelled up the Severn estuary and into the River Avon. Remembers before being hauled overland across the Chalk Downs to Stonehenge. Remembers experimental archaeology has shown just how demanding this process would have been. Remembers moving a 3-ton stone across level ground requires around 100 people working in coordination. On uneven terrain, progress slows dramatically. As hills, river crossings, and soft ground multiply the difficulty. This was not a one-time effort. Estimates suggest that up to 80 bluestones eventually reached Stonehenge. Remembers transporting them would have required multiple expeditions, each lasting months or years. Remembers involving hundreds of people and massive logistical support, food, tools, ropes, and shelters. Remembers why commit generations of labor to move stones that could have been replaced with local material? The answer is not engineering. It is belief. The blue stones were not interchangeable. Remembers they were chosen because of where they came from, not just what they were. In Neolithic thought, landscapes held memory. Stones absorbed power from the places they emerged. Remembers by bringing Preseli stone to Stonehenge, the builders were binding distant communities together politically, ritually, and symbolically. Remember, some archaeologists argue that this movement reflects migration, and that groups from Wales physically relocated to Salisbury Plain. Remembers bringing their ancestral stones with them to establish continuity in a new land. As others suggest alliance building. Remembers the stones may have been gifts exchanged to seal relationships between distant communities, ensuring cooperation on a project that demanded unprecedented trust. Either way, the act reshaped Stonehenge forever. Remembers the first bluestone circle erected within the existing earthwork marked a turning point. Stone replaced wood. Permanence replaced flexibility. The monument began to assert itself against time. Remembers, the initial arrangement appears to have been a double circle, an outer ring of approximately 60 stones, an inner ring of around 20. Remembers, the stones were carefully positioned, with taller monoliths marking cardinal points and astronomically significant directions. Yet even stone did not freeze Stonehenge into a final form. That archaeological evidence shows that the blue stones were repeatedly rearranged. Remember, stoneholes reveal multiple phases of erection, removal, reshaping, and reinstallation. The monument evolved as ritual needs evolved. This adaptability is crucial. Stonehenge was never a single statement. It was a conversation across generations. Remembers, as blue stones transformed the monument, so too did its social meaning. Burial practices became more elaborate. Remember, grave goods appeared, amber beads from the Baltic, bone pins finally made pottery. Access to burial within the monument began to narrow, suggesting emerging social differentiation. Remember, Stonehenge was becoming selective. And as it did, the scale of ambition increased once more. Remembers, because the blue stones, extraordinary as they were only the beginning. Remembers, the builders were about to attempt something even more audacious, something that would redefine what prehistoric societies were capable of achieving. Remembers, they would raise stones larger than any previously moved in Britain. Remembers, they would shape them with precision measured in millimeters. Remembers, and they would lock them together in ways that defied gravity itself. Remembers, to do this, Stonehenge would need to become more than a sacred place. Remembers, it would need to become a machine engineered, coordinated, and controlled. And for that, a new culture was arriving. Remembers, and so the question facing the builders of Stonehenge was no longer whether humans could move sacred stone, but whether they could command stone itself. Remembers, the arrival of the blue stones had already stretched the limits of Neolithic cooperation. Remembers, yet they were modest in size compared to what would come next. Remembers, around 2500 BC, a new phase began, one that would permanently alter both the monument and the society that built it. This transformation did not start with architecture, but it began with people. Across Britain, a cultural shift was underway. Remembers, archaeologists refer to it as the beaker phenomenon. Remembers, named after the distinctive bell-shaped pottery that suddenly appeared across vast regions of Europe. But to describe it merely as a pottery style is to miss its true significance. Remembers, the beaker culture represented a new social order, one defined by mobility, hierarchy, technological innovation, and individual status. Remembers, these people brought with them metallurgy, new burial practices, and new ways of expressing power. Remembers, they valued personal achievement, wealth, and identity in ways earlier Neolithic communities had not. Remembers, and when they encountered Stonehenge, they recognized something extraordinary. Men, a place capable of projecting authority on a scale no individual burial or settlement ever could. Stonehenge would become their stage. Remembers, the most visible symbol of this transformation was the decision to construct the monument's most iconic feature, the sarsen circle and trilithons. Remembers, sarsen stone is a type of exceptionally hard sandstone formed during the Paleocene epoch, millions of years before humans existed. Remembers, by the time of Stonehenge's construction, these stones lay scattered across the Marlborough Downs, roughly 20 miles north of the site. Some weighed more than 50 tons. Selecting these stones was not random. The geological analysis shows that the builders consistently chose sarsens from specific areas of the Downs where the stone was dense, durable, and relatively free of fractures. Remembers, this required extensive surveying and knowledge passed down through experience. Remembers, these were not untrained laborers stumbling upon large rocks. Remembers, they were specialists who understood stone as a material with both physical and symbolic properties. Remembers, moving the sarsens posed challenges unlike anything encountered during the bluestone phase. Remembers, experimental archaeology has demonstrated that transporting a 40-ton stone across chalk terrain would require a workforce of at least 500 people, supported by sledges, rope systems, and carefully prepared routes. Remembers, the ground itself had to be modified, leveled, reinforced, and stabilized to prevent the massive loads from sinking or tipping. This was infrastructure. Timber sledges built from massive oak beams distributed the stone's weight. Remembers, while ropes made from twisted plant fibers or leather strips transferred human force into motion. Remembers, the scale of these rope systems is difficult to imagine. Remembers, several miles of rope may have been required to move a single stone, demanding enormous investments of labor and raw material. Remembers, transport alone was only the beginning. Once a sarsen arrived at Stonehenge, it had to be shaped. Unlike bluestones, which were relatively small and irregular, the sarsens were transformed into architectural components with astonishing precision. Remembers, the builders used sarsen hammerstone, smaller blocks of the same material, to peck away surfaces slowly, methodically shaping uprights and lintels. This process took months, perhaps years, for each stone. Remembers, the uprights were subtly tapered, narrower at the top than the base. Remembers, creating an illusion of height and elegance while maintaining structural stability. Remembers, the lintels were curved to follow the circular plan of the monument, requiring careful measurement and foresight. As these curves were not decorative accidents, as they were calculated. The most remarkable innovation, however, was the joinery. Remembers, borrowing techniques from advanced woodworking traditions, the builders carved mortars and tenon joints directly into stone. Remembers, protruding tenons were shaped atop the uprights, while corresponding mortises were cut into the underside of the lintels. Remembers, when assembled, these joints locked the stones together, preventing lateral movement and distributing weight evenly. The tolerances involved were measured in millimeters, as any error would have rendered the joint useless. Remembers, achieving this level of precision without metal tools required master craftsmen with deep knowledge of stone behavior, geometry, and load-bearing mechanics. Remembers, tongue and groove joints between adjacent lintels further stabilized the ring. Remembers, allowing the structure to absorb minor shifts caused by settling or temperature changes without catastrophic failure. Remembers, this was engineering at the highest prehistoric level. Erecting the stones demanded equal ingenuity. Remembers, deep stone holes were excavated with sloped sides and carefully undercut edges. Ramps were built to slide the uprights into position, while ropes and wooden levers gradually raised them to vertical. Remembers, once aligned, the holes were backfilled with chalk rubble and packing stones to lock the monoliths in place. Lifting the lintels posed even greater challenges. Remembers, the most widely accepted theory involves massive timber framework scaffold-like structures that allowed weighing up to 10 tons to be hoisted more than 4 meters above ground. Earth ramps may also have been used, built up around the uprights and later removed. Remembers, either method required extraordinary coordination, planning, and trust. Remembers, the result was an architectural composition unlike anything previously built in Europe. Remembers, a circle of towering sarsen uprights capped by a continuous ring of lintels enclosed the monument. Remembers, within it stood 5 colossal trilithons arranged in a horseshoe pattern, their heights carefully graded to draw the eye toward the center. At the heart of this arrangement stood the tallest trilithon, aligned precisely with the winter solstice sunset. Remembers, when viewed from within the monument, the sun appeared to descend directly between its uprights on the shortest day of the year. This alignment was not decorative, it encoded power. Remembers, where earlier phases of Stonehenge emphasized cyclical renewal and communal ritual, the sarsen phase projected permanence, authority, and control over cosmic order. The monument no longer adapted easily, but stone replaced flexibility with dominance. Remembers, this shift was mirrored in burial practices. Remembers, during the Beaker period, cremation declined and inhumation became more common. Burials emphasized individual identity rather than collective ancestry. Remembers, grave goods multiplied, metal daggers, gold ornaments, wrist guards, and finely crafted pottery accompanied the dead. Remembers, the most famous of these burials, the Immersive archer, was discovered just 3 miles from Stonehenge. Remembers, dating to around 2300 BC, his grave contained an unprecedented collection of wealth, including copper knives, gold hair ornaments, stone wrist guards, and arrowheads. Remembers, isotope analysis revealed that he had grown up in the alpine regions of Central Europe before migrating to Britain. Stonehenge was no longer regional, it was international. Remembers, the presence of migrants from across Europe among those buried near Stonehenge demonstrates that the monument became a focal point for elite networks spanning vast distances. Remembers, these individuals brought new technologies, beliefs, and social structures that reshaped the cultural landscape of Britain. Yet this transformation carried consequences. As power concentrated, access narrowed. Burial within Stonehenge became increasingly restricted. The monument's role shifted from communal sacred space to elite ceremonial center. Remembers, ritual activity continued, but it was no longer inclusive. Stonehenge had become a statement. Remembers, a declaration that certain individuals and certain groups stood closer to cosmic order than others. Remembers, still even this monumental phase was not static. Remembers, the blue stones were rearranged yet again, reshaped to form an inner horseshoe that echoed the trilithon arrangement. Remembers, the altar stone was repositioned at the center, emphasizing hierarchical focus and directional movement. This integration of old and new materials symbolized continuity amid change. Remembers, the ancestral stones from Wales remained essential, even as Beaker culture imposed new architectural logic. Stonehenge had become a layered monument, its stones recording shifts in belief, power, and identity across centuries. But monuments, like societies, cannot expand indefinitely. Remembers, by the early Bronze Age, the forces that had driven Stonehenge's greatest achievements were beginning to unravel. But cooperative labor on massive scales became unsustainable. Wealth and authority consolidated. Defense replaced construction. The monument's role shifted once more. What had begun as a communal engine of ritual had become a symbol respected, feared, but increasingly distant from everyday life. Stonehenge still mattered, but it no longer belonged to everyone. Remembered, as the stones stood immovable beneath the sky, the world around them was already moving on. Remembers, and yet even as Stonehenge reached its most imposing physical form, the forces that sustained it were already beginning to shift, quietly and irreversibly. By the early Bronze Age, Stonehenge no longer needed to be built, it needed to be understood, used, reinterpreted, and eventually let go. Remembers, the massive trilithons stood complete, their stone joints locked in place with a precision that seemed to defy time. Remembers, but while the architecture appeared eternal, the society that gathered around it was not. Remembers, human priorities were changing, and Stonehenge, once the engine of collective ritual life, was slowly becoming something else. Remembers, one of the clearest signs of this transformation was the rearrangement of the blue stones. Remembers, nearly 1,000 years after their arduous journey from Wales, as these stones were dismantled from their earlier configurations and re-erected within the shadow of the Sarsen trelithons. So this was not a minor modification. Remembers, was a comprehensive reorganization that required careful planning, technical skill, and respect for the monument's existing structure. Stone holes from this phase reveal repeated experimentation. Remembers, some positions were used, abandoned, and reused multiple times as builders adjusted the spatial relationships between stones. Remembers, the final configuration formed an inner horseshoe that mirrored the shape of the trilithon arrangement. Remembers, visually and symbolically integrating the ancestral Welsh stones with the monumental Sarsen architecture. This integration mattered. The blue stones represented memory, migration, and inherited power. Remembers, the Sarsens represented dominance, permanence, and authority. Remembers, bringing them into a single coherent design was an attempt to reconcile past and present, ancestry and hierarchy, movement and control. Remembers, at the center of this reconfiguration stood the altar stone. Remembers, despite its name, there is no evidence that this stone was used for sacrifice. Remembers, instead, its position suggests a focal marker, a place toward which movement, attention, and ritual energy converge. Its geological origin, likely from Western Britain. Remembers, reinforced the monument's role as a meeting point of distant landscapes and traditions. Remembers, yet this final architectural act carried an unintended message. Stonehenge was now complete enough to no longer need change. Remembers, and in that stillness its role began to diminish. Across the Salisbury Plain, burial practices were undergoing a profound shift. Remembers, the communal cremation traditions that once defined Stonehenge's early use gave way to individual burials placed beneath round barrows scattered across the landscape. Remembers, these mounds, often positioned on prominent ridgelines, commemorated specific individuals rather than collective ancestors. This was not merely a change in funerary custom. Remembers, was a change in worldview. Remembers, the dead were no longer remembered as part of a continuous lineage housed within shared monuments. Remembers, they were remembered as individuals whose status, achievements, and possessions deserved permanent display. Remembers, grave goods multiplied, bronze daggers, gold ornaments, finely crafted pottery marking wealth and distinction. Stonehenge, once a cemetery of many, ceased to function as a burial site. Remembers, instead it became a place of ceremony without permanence. Remembers, offerings replaced intimate. Presence replaced belonging. Remembers, the avenue connecting Stonehenge to the River Avon took on new significance during this period. Remembers, processions moved along its length carrying ritual objects, food, and symbolic materials. Archaeological deposits along the avenue, broken pottery, animal bones. Bronze fragments suggest pauses for feasting and ceremonial acts that transformed the journey itself into ritual. The river played a central role. Water in Bronze Age belief systems marked boundaries between worlds, states of being, and phases of life. Remembers, depositing objects into the Avon was a way of relinquishing them, transferring value from the human realm to forces beyond control. Weapons, tools, and ornaments recovered from the river were deliberately placed, not lost. Early deposits appear individual, personal. Later ones suggest coordinated communal offerings, reflecting evolving social structures and collective identities. Yet even these ceremonies began to wane. Remembers, by the Middle Bronze Age, large-scale ritual gatherings at Stonehenge had become rare. Remembers, communities increasingly focused their energies elsewhere, on defended settlements, on local shrines. Remembers, on emerging regional centers better suited to new social realities. Remembers, climate played its part. Remembers, around 1200 BC, cooler and wetter conditions reduced agricultural productivity across much of Britain. Marginal lands became harder to farm. Population levels likely declined. Remembers, in such conditions, maintaining ancient ceremonial obligations became a burden few could afford. Stonehenge was not abandoned overnight. As it faded, small groups continued to visit. Private rituals took place within the stone circle. Votive deposits were left quietly, often involving miniature objects, tiny pottery vessels. Remember, small bronze tools, symbolic substitutes for the full offerings of earlier generations. These acts were intimate, restrained, and personal. Stonehenge had become a place for reflection rather than spectacle. By the time Iron Age societies rose across Britain, the monument was already ancient beyond living memory. No new stones were raised. No earthworks expanded. The trilithons stood as relics of a world whose logic had been replaced. Yet they were not ignored. When Roman forces arrived in Britain during the 1st century BC, they encountered Stonehenge as a powerful ruin, old enough to command reverence, mysterious enough to inspire superstition. Roman artifacts found at the site tell a story of continued visitation rather than neglect. Remembers, coins from across the empire, many deliberately damaged, were deposited around the monument. Remembers, pottery, personal ornaments, and religious objects reflect pilgrimage rather than occupation. Remember, Stonehenge functioned as a sacred destination within Romano-British spiritual life. Roman religious practice was flexible, whereas rather than suppressing local traditions, Roman authorities often absorbed them, aligning indigenous sacred sites with imperial deities. Remembers, at Stonehenge, solar associations made the worship of Apollo particularly appropriate. Remembers, dedications to Minerva suggest interest in wisdom, craftsmanship, and perhaps the monument's architectural genius. These practices did not erase Celtic belief systems. They blended with them. Remembers, Stonehenge became a place where traditions overlapped, where old gods were reinterpreted rather than forgotten. Remembers, Christian influence, by contrast, left little trace during the Roman period. If Christian rituals occurred here, they did so quietly. The monument's pagan associations were deeply entrenched. Remembers, and early Christianity often avoided sites too heavily burdened with pre-existing sacred meaning. Remembers, with the collapse of Roman rule in the 5th century AD, remembers, Britain entered a period of fragmentation that reshaped how Stonehenge was understood. Saxon settlers brought new mythologies, new languages, and new ways of interpreting the past. Remembers, unable to explain the monument through inherited tradition, they explained it through story. Stonehenge became a place of magic. Remembers, its very name reflects this shift derived from words describing hanging stones, emphasizing the uncanny nature of lintels balanced atop uprights. Remembers, medieval people did not ask how Stonehenge was built. They asked who possessed the power to build it. The answer inevitably was supernatural. Remembers, by the 12th century, chroniclers such as Geoffrey of Monmouth crafted elaborate legends to explain the monument's origins. Remembers, in his telling, giants raised the stones in Ireland, and the wizard Merlin transported them to Britain through magical means. The story satisfied medieval expectations. Wisdom triumphing over brute force, ancient knowledge legitimizing royal authority. Merlin's Stonehenge was not archaeology, it was meaning. Remembers, the legend explained why the stones were different, why they seemed alive, why they were believed to heal. Medieval pilgrims visited Stonehenge seeking cures. Remembers, water poured over the stones was thought to acquire medicinal properties capable of restoring health and fertility. Remembers, archaeological evidence, pottery, metalwork, devotional objects confirms sustained visitation throughout the Middle Ages. As these practices did not directly conflict with Christianity. Remembers, pilgrims often visited nearby churches as well, viewing Stonehenge as complementary rather than heretical. Remembers, pagan memory and Christian belief coexisted in a pragmatic balance that allowed the monument to persist. Folklore became its defense. Stories of ghosts, guardians, and supernatural punishment discouraged vandalism. Remembers, fear protected what law could not. Remembers, in this way, Stonehenge survived centuries of neglect, stone robbing, and agricultural expansion that destroyed countless other monuments. By the early modern period, however, belief itself began to change. The Protestant Reformation weakened pilgrimage traditions. Renaissance humanism encouraged empirical observation over myth. Stonehenge shifted once more from sacred relic to intellectual problem. Remember, 17th century antiquarians arrived with measuring chains instead of offerings. Remembers, John Aubrey's meticulous survey revealed features invisible to casual observers, including the Ring of Pits now bearing his name. Remembers, William Stukeley's drawings captured alignments and architectural relationships that hinted at astronomical purpose. They did not fully understand Stonehenge, but they asked the right questions. Remembers, their work transformed curiosity into inquiry, setting the stage for scientific archaeology. Remembers, over the next 3 centuries, excavations, debates, and discoveries gradually stripped away legend while deepening mystery. Stonehenge became evidence not of magic but of human capability, and in that recognition lay its most unsettling implication. If prehistoric societies could conceive, organize, and execute projects of this scale and complexity, remembers, then modern assumptions about progress, intelligence, and civilization required revision. Remember, Stonehenge was no longer just ancient, it was humbling. Whereas by the 20th century, scientific methods, radiocarbon dating, isotope analysis, geophysical survey revealed the monument's true depth. Remember, was not a single creation but a process unfolding over more than 15 centuries. Remember, was not isolated but embedded within a vast ceremonial landscape. Stonehenge had outlived every system that tried to define it. Sacred engine, elite symbol, pilgrimage site, national curiosity. But each generation found its own reflection in the stones. And perhaps that is why Stonehenge endures. But not because it offers answers, but because it absorbs questions. Remembers, as its builders faded into history, their monument remained. Remembers, silently challenging every culture that encountered it to consider what humans are willing to build when belief, power, and time intersect. Stonehenge did not end, and it became a mirror. And so, having survived belief, abandonment, myth, and rediscovery, remembers, Stonehenge entered its final transformation not as a relic of the past, but as a question directed at the modern world. Remembers, by the late 20th century, Stonehenge was no longer owned by any single culture, religion, or nation. It had become global. Remembers, scientists, tourists, spiritual seekers, governments, and corporations all claimed a stake in its meaning. Yet this attention brought a paradox the monument had never faced before: preservation through distance. Stonehenge was no longer at risk of being forgotten. It was at risk of being loved to death. Remembers, as archaeology matured into a rigorous scientific discipline, Stonehenge became a proving ground for new methods and new questions. Remembers, the focus shifted from isolated stones to systems, from monument to landscape. Remembers, researchers began to understand that Stonehenge was not a solitary marvel but the most visible node in an immense network of ritual. Remembers, movement and memory spread across the Salisbury Plain. As projects such as the Stonehenge Riverside Project fundamentally reshaped interpretation. Remembers, excavations revealed that the monument's purpose could not be reduced to a single function. Remembers, it was not only a burial ground, nor solely an astronomical observatory, nor merely a political symbol. Remembers, it was all of these things at different times for different people. But this multiplicity was not a flaw in interpretation. It was the truth. Remembers, high-precision radiocarbon dating demonstrated that Stonehenge was built, dismantled, and rebuilt across more than 15 centuries. Each phase reflected changing social structures, economic realities, and cosmological ideas. The monument did not freeze belief into stone. It recorded belief in motion. Remembers, isotope analysis of cremated remains revealed that many individuals buried at Stonehenge had grown up far from southern Britain, Scotland, as continental Europe. Remembers, these were not isolated farmers paying homage to a local shrine. Remembers, they were participants in long-distance networks of exchange, alliance, and shared ritual language. Remembers, Stonehenge was international long before the modern world invented the word. Done analysis added another layer. Remembers, genetic evidence showed that some of those buried within the monument were related. Remembers, while others were not suggesting that kinship mattered but did not exclusively govern access. Remembers, belief, status, and purpose likely played equally powerful roles. As this raised uncomfortable questions. Who was allowed into Stonehenge? Who was excluded? And who decided? Remembers, the archaeological record suggests regulation. Remembers, access to burial within the monument was controlled, especially in later phases. Remember, this implies authority leaders or priestly figures capable of enforcing ritual boundaries. Remembers, yet there is no evidence of centralized kingship during Stonehenge's earliest phases. Power, it seems, was negotiated rather than imposed. Remembers, modern astronomical modeling further refined understanding of the monument's alignments. Stonehenge was not a crude calendar nor a passive observatory. Remembers, its design encoded specific solar events, particularly the summer solstice sunrise and winter solstice sunset moments that framed the agricultural and ceremonial year. But these alignments were not static. Remembers, due to gradual changes in Earth's axial and orbital mechanics, celestial positions shift over millennia. Remember, Stonehenge builders would have needed to adjust stone placements to maintain accuracy. Remembers, this explains some of the monument's internal rearrangements and reinforces the idea that it functioned as a living system rather than a finished product. Sound, too, emerged as a forgotten dimension. Remembers, acoustic studies revealed that the stone circle amplifies and focuses sound, creating echo effects that would have enhanced chanting, drumming, or spoken ritual. Within the trilithons, voices carry differently. Silence feels heavier. Space becomes performative. Stonehenge was not only meant to be seen, it was meant to be experienced. Remembers, this sensory dimension helps explain why the monument retained power long after its original builders vanished. Meaning was not abstract, it was embodied. Remembers, yet for all modern science has uncovered, fundamental questions remain unanswered. Why this place specifically became the nucleus of such sustained effort. Remembers, why stones from Wales mattered enough to justify generational labor. Why the monument evolved rather than being completed once and abandoned. Remembers, no single theory resolves these mysteries because Stonehenge was not designed to answer one question. It was designed to hold many. Remembers, the 20th century progressed, a new challenge emerged. Mass visitation. Stonehenge attracts more than 1 million visitors each year. Foot traffic compressed chalk soils. Remembers, drainage patterns shifted. As archaeological deposits were damaged by pressure alone. Remembers, the very act of witnessing the monument threatened its survival. In response, the site was transformed yet again. Remembers, the new visitor center opened in 2013 relocated infrastructure away from the stones themselves. Shuttle systems replaced roads. Timed entry regulated crowds. As conservation became as much a part of Stonehenge's identity as research. The designation of Stonehenge as a UNESCO World Heritage Site formalized this balance between access and protection. The monument was no longer merely British heritage. Remembers, was human heritage. But protection came at a cost. Strict regulations limit excavation. Many questions must remain unanswered to preserve what remains. Remembers, archaeology, once invasive by necessity, has become cautious, selective, and increasingly dependent on destructive technologies. A ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and LIDAR mapping now reveal hidden features without disturbing the soil. Remembers, these surveys have uncovered dozens of previously unknown monuments, timber circles, pit alignments. Remembers, and processional routes expanding the Stonehenge story outward rather than downward. Remembers the most dramatic of these discoveries, the so-called Superhenge beneath Durrington walls. Remembers suggests that the visible Stonehenge is only a fragment of what once existed. Remembers entire monumental complexes may lie buried, erased by time but not by memory. This realization reframes everything. But Stonehenge was never meant to stand alone. It was one voice in a vast ceremonial chorus. Yet despite this growing body of knowledge, Stonehenge continues to resist closure. Members, every explanation generates new uncertainty. Members, every discovery raises deeper questions about prehistoric consciousness, cooperation, and purpose. Remembers, why were people willing to labor for generations on a project they would never see completed? What belief system sustained such patience? What vision of time allowed meaning to extend beyond individual lives? Modern societies, driven by immediacy and efficiency, struggle to comprehend such commitments. Perhaps that is why Stonehenge feels unsettling. It exposes a mismatch between technological advancement and existential depth. Remembers, the builders lacked metal, writing, and machines, yet they possessed something increasingly rare, a shared sense of purpose that transcended the self. Stonehenge reminds us that complexity is not synonymous with progress. Remembers, it also reminds us that monuments are not merely structures. They are agreements. Agreements about what matters enough to preserve. Agreements about who belongs. Agreements about how the living relate to the dead and the present to the future. Stonehenge's builders never explained their intentions because they did not need to. Their audience was not us, it was time. And time answered. As the stones still stand, weathered, scarred, incomplete. Yet they continue to shape human imagination more than 4 millennia after the last hand touched them in reverence. Remembers, today visitors arrive with cameras instead of offerings. They watch the sun rise along the same axis marked by prehistoric builders. Some feel awe. Others feel nothing. Both responses are part of the monument's legacy. Stonehenge does not demand belief, it invites reflection. In an age of rapid change, it asks what endures. In a world of individual ambition, it asks what can only be built together. Remembers, in a civilization obsessed with explanation, it asks whether mystery itself has value. Perhaps Stonehenge was never meant to be solved. Remembers, perhaps it was meant to remain quietly, patiently while humanity changes around it. Not as a message from the past, remembers, but as a reminder of what humans are capable of when they choose meaning over convenience, continuity over speed, and shared purpose over individual reward. Stonehenge is not a ruin. It is a question. Remembers, and we are still answering it. Remembers, Stonehenge endures not because we have fully understood it, but because it refuses to be reduced to a single explanation. Remembers, across more than 4,000 years, it has shifted from sacred engine to elite symbol, from pilgrimage site to scientific subject, from living ritual space to protected heritage. Remembers, each generation encountered the stones and asked a different question, and each time. Remember, Stonehenge absorbed that question without surrendering its core mystery. Remembers, what makes this monument truly extraordinary is not the weight of its stones or the precision of its alignments, but the mindset that created it. Remembers, Stonehenge was built by people who accepted that the most meaningful work in life might never benefit them personally. Remembers, they labored for futures they would not see, for ceremonies they would not attend, for meanings that would outlive their names. Remembers, in a world without writing, contracts, or formal states, they coordinated belief, labor, and time across generations. And that is the lesson Stonehenge offers us today. Modern life teaches speed, efficiency, and personal gain. Remembers, we are encouraged to measure value by immediate results and visible rewards. Stonehenge stands in quiet opposition to that logic. It reminds us that some forms of meaning only emerge slowly through patience, consistency, and shared purpose. Remembers, not everything worth building is meant to be finished quickly, and not everything valuable needs to be owned individually. Applied to our own lives, this perspective invites a shift. Remembers, it asks us to think beyond short-term success and consider what we are contributing to that will last. Remembers, this could mean investing in relationships rather than transactions, building skills rather than chasing status. Remembers, creating work that serves others rather than only ourselves, or nurturing values within families, communities. Remembers, in institutions that may only fully bloom long after we are gone. Stonehenge also teaches restraint. Remembers, builders adapted, rearranged, and eventually stepped back. They knew when to build and when to stop. Remembers, in an age of constant expansion and consumption, knowing when enough is enough may be one of the most radical forms of wisdom. Ultimately, Stonehenge is not about stones. Remembers, it is about time, cooperation, and intention. It asks us a quiet but powerful question. Remembers, what are we willing to commit to that transcends our own lifespan? Before we close, here's a simple question for you. Remembers, do you believe the most meaningful things in life are built quickly or slowly over time? Remembers, please share your perspective in the comments below so everyone can read and reflect together. Remembers, if you found value in this journey through history and meaning, consider subscribing to the channel to support Empire's Historical. Remembers, your support helps us continue creating deep, thoughtful content like this in the future.